Before we begin, I want to tell you why this story matters. This story was inspired by a real event that moved an entire nation to tears. In 1988, in the city of Xi'an, China, a 2-year-old boy named Mao Yin was abducted while his father paused at a hotel entrance to get water. In that single unguarded moment, the boy was taken and later sold to a childless couple in Sichuan province for the equivalent of $840. He was given a new name, a new family, and raised with no knowledge of where he truly came from. His mother, Jingzhi, spent the next 32 years of her life refusing to stop searching. She distributed over 100,000 flyers across China. She chased more than 300 false leads. She appeared on television programs. She partnered with missing children organizations and, in the process of looking for her own son, helped reunite 29 other families with theirs. She never stopped. Not for one day. In May 2020, facial recognition technology and a DNA test confirmed what her heart had never stopped believing. Her son was alive. Their reunion on Mother's Day 2020 was watched by millions across China and left almost no one dry-eyed. A 34-year-old man ran toward his mother with outstretched arms, and she held him and said she would never let him go again. What follows is a fictional reimagining of that same miracle, set in the neon-lit criminal underworld of Seoul, where a mother's 32-year search finally collides with the last man on earth anyone would expect her lost son to have become. This story is shared for educational and awareness purposes. It is a reminder that love which refuses to give up is not weakness. It is one of the most quietly powerful forces on this earth. Hold that thought as we begin. Seoul does not stop for anyone. That is not a saying. It is simply the truth of the city, something you feel the moment you step into it, the way the traffic moves and the neon breathes and the buildings lean over you like they are in a hurry too. The Han River district at night is a blur of black glass and amber light, of delivery bikes threading between luxury sedans, of the city running its endless performance at full volume with no intermission and no apology. And moving through it all, like a shadow that had learned to give itself weight, was the armored black Mercedes that the entire city had quietly learned to step aside for. Not because of the plates. Not because of the tinted windows or the way it moved through traffic like the signals were suggestions meant for other people, but because of the name attached to it. A name that did not need to be spoken to be felt. The kind of name that arrives in a room before the person does and lingers after they leave, like a change in air pressure. Chun Min-Jun. He sat in the back seat with one hand resting on his knee and his eyes fixed somewhere past the window, on nothing in particular and everything at once. The meeting tonight had been the kind that left a mark on a room even after everyone had filed out of it. 3 syndicate heads. 2 contested territories along the southern corridor. 1 agreement assembled from equal parts calculation and threat, held together by the thinnest thread of mutual fear. He had walked out with exactly what he came for. He always did. That was not arrogance. That was simply the record of his life, built from nothing, stone by stone, year by year, without mercy from anyone and without asking for any. The driver pushed through a yellow light. Then another. The city parted the way it always did. Then the brakes screamed. Chun's body jerked forward against the seatbelt, his hand finding the door handle before conscious thought had caught up with reflex. The car shuddered to a stop. For 1 suspended second the only sound was the engine ticking and the distant pulse of the city carrying on without them. Then he looked through the windshield. Caught in the full white flood of the headlights, standing in the exact center of the crosswalk, was a small elderly woman. She was not looking at the car. She was not reacting to the screech of tires or the blinding light or the 2 tons of German engineering that had stopped 6 inches from her body. Her eyes were somewhere else entirely, fixed on a distance that had nothing to do with this street, this night, or any of the ordinary geography around her. She was looking at something that only she could see, and whatever it was, it had been pulling at her for a very long time. Then her knees gave out. She did not fall the way a person falls from surprise or fear, with their arms going out and their body fighting it. She went down the way something goes down that has been carrying an impossible weight for longer than it should have had to, and has finally, in one quiet moment, simply run out of the strength to keep pretending otherwise. It was a slow, almost dignified collapse. Her handbag struck the asphalt first. Then her palms. Then her cheek came to rest against the cold road, gently, like she was finally lying down after years of refusing to. The car had stopped 6 inches from her body. Silence settled over the street like something physical. "Boss," one of his men started from the front seat, his voice careful. Chun was already opening the door. He stepped out into the amber light of the Han River district and stood over her in the road. His bodyguards deployed automatically behind him, fanning out in practiced formation, hands moving near holsters, eyes sweeping the surrounding street for threats. They found none. No rival cars idling at the curb. No figures in doorways. Just the ordinary empty night, the wind moving down the boulevard, and one unconscious elderly woman on the asphalt in front of the most feared man in Seoul. He crouched down. He was not doing this out of compassion. That needed to be understood clearly, at least by him. Chun Min-Jun did not stop for strangers in crosswalks. He did not crouch over unconscious women on public roads. He did not do any of this. But a dead civilian is a problem. A dead civilian means a police report, and a police report means an investigation, and an investigation means attention. And he could not afford attention right now, not with the Southern Corridor Agreement still fresh and 3 syndicate heads who would love nothing more than a window to move against him while he was occupied with something else. He told himself that was the only reason he got out of the car. He almost believed it. His eyes moved across the street, not out of concern but out of habit. Then something caught at the edge of his vision. A single sheet of paper, escaped from the woman's open bag, skittering across the asphalt in the night wind, tumbling end over end until it crossed into the beam of his headlights and was caught there for just a moment, pinned by the light, before the wind could carry it into the dark. He almost ignored it. Almost stood up, gave the order to call an ambulance, and put the whole thing behind him by the time they reached the next block. But something made him reach out and pick it up. If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My mother said I wouldn't even reach 10,000 subscribers, but I believe stories like this deserve to be heard. Help me show her that these tales matter. 3 words in bold black ink looked back at him from the crumpled page. Missing child. Min-Jun. Below the words was a photograph. A toddler, no older than 3 years old. Round cheeks soft with baby weight. Eyes tilted slightly upward at their outer corners, giving the child's face a permanent expression of quiet, private amusement, as if the world were offering him a joke he had not yet decided whether to share. And above the left eyebrow, almost too faint to notice unless you were looking directly at it, a small pale scar. The kind left by a childhood tumble. The kind that someone once kissed and promised would heal and probably forgot about within the week. Chun did not forget about it. Because his hand was already moving slowly, without instruction from any conscious part of him, 2 fingers pressing against the scar above his own left eyebrow. The one director Huang had always explained away with the same 4 words, delivered in the same unbothered tone. From the fire. You were too young to remember it. The fire that had also, according to the story he had been handed and never once thought to question, killed his mother before he was old enough to carry her face in his memory. He stood in the crosswalk with the flyer in his hand for a long time. Long enough that his bodyguards exchanged glances they were careful to keep small. Then he straightened up. His voice, when it came, was steady. It was always steady. But something underneath it was not, and the men closest to him had been with him long enough to hear the difference. Get her to a hospital. Private ward. Tell them she is under my protection. His lead bodyguard, 11 years of service behind him and almost nothing left in the world that surprised him, stared. Sir. Did I stutter? They moved. And Chun stood alone in the headlights for one more moment, the flyer still in his hand, looking at the face of a 3-year-old boy he had never met and could not stop looking at. Somewhere in the deepest and most carefully sealed part of him, something that had no name and no logical basis and no place inside the life he had constructed shifted. It felt, against every reasonable objection he could raise, like the very first stir of a memory he had been told did not exist. If this story is already doing something to you that you were not expecting, please subscribe now so you do not miss a single chapter of what comes next. This is only the beginning. The hospital was the kind of private that most people in Seoul did not know existed. No public-facing admissions desk. No waiting room with plastic chairs and a television mounted too high on the wall. Just a discreet entrance off a side street in Gangnam, a staff that had learned the particular discipline of asking only what was necessary, and a standard of care that cost more per night than most people earned in a month. Chun kept accounts there for exactly these kinds of situations, though the situations were usually of a different nature entirely. Tonight was something new. His men had her admitted within 12 minutes of the crosswalk. Private ward, 3rd floor, end of the corridor. The attending physician was given the information required to treat her and nothing more. The nurses understood from the quality of the silence surrounding the men in dark suits outside the door that there were no further questions worth asking. Chun stood in the corridor while they worked. He did not pace. He was not a man who paced. Pacing was what people did when they could not control the outcome of something, and Chun had spent 20 years ensuring that he was never in a room where he could not control the outcome. He stood with his hands in his coat pockets and his back straight and his eyes somewhere in the middle distance, and if anyone looking at him had tried to describe what they saw, they would have said he looked perfectly calm. They would have been describing the surface. One of his men brought him the woman's bag. Standard procedure. When an unknown civilian enters the orbit of your operations, you catalog what they are carrying. You identify who they are. You assess the risk. It was the kind of thing you did automatically after enough years in this life, the way doctors wash their hands without thinking about it. Chun took the bag and opened it himself. He expected the ordinary contents of an elderly woman's life. A small wallet worn soft at the corners. Medication in a labeled bottle. Maybe a phone with a cracked screen and a grandchild's photograph set as the wallpaper. The quiet, accumulated practicality of a person who had learned what they needed to carry and had stopped carrying anything else. What he found made the breath go out of him in a way that he would never describe to anyone, and that no one standing near him would have been able to see from the outside. The bag was full of flyers. Not a few loose sheets stuffed in carelessly. Dozens of them, neatly folded and organized with the precision of someone who had been doing this long enough for it to become a kind of devotion. A ritual performed the same way every time because the sameness of it was the only thing that still made sense. He pulled one out and unfolded it. Then reached for another. Then a third, this one on slightly older paper, the ink a shade more faded, the fold lines worn white with handling. Different print runs. Different years on the dates at the bottom. The same face in every single one. Round cheeks. Eyes at a slight upward tilt. A small scar above the left eyebrow. He went through them until he reached the bottom of the stack. The oldest one was dated 1991. The paper had gone the color of old cream and the edges had softened with age, but the photograph was still clear. The same child. The same face. 32 years of the same face, carried in the same bag, folded and unfolded and refolded until the creases had become part of the paper itself. Chun held the 1991 flyer under the corridor light and did not speak. Around him his men stood or moved quietly, performing their tasks with a particular careful efficiency of people who sense that something is happening in the room that they do not have the context to understand. Nobody asked questions. Nobody made unnecessary sound. The corridor was very quiet except for the faint mechanical hum of the hospital doing its work behind closed doors. 32 years. Someone had printed this flyer in 1991, and then printed it again in a different year, and then again, and again after that, updating the paper but never the face on it because the face never changed, because a lost child does not age in a mother's memory the way they age in the world. Someone had carried all of these folded carefully in a bag and walked them into every kind of place where a human eye might land on them. Markets. Laundromats. The insides of bus shelters. The bulletin boards outside schools and churches. the back walls of public restrooms. For 32 years. He did not know how long he stood there looking at the flyer. Eventually, without turning to look at any of his men, he spoke. Get me her full background. Everything you can find before morning. And pull the blood type from her hospital intake form and bring it to me directly. Nobody asked why he wanted the blood type. That was one of the things about working for Chun. You learned very quickly that the questions you were not asked to answer were not questions you were meant to ask. You simply did what was required and trusted that the reason would reveal itself in time. It usually did. Chun folded the 1991 flyer carefully along its original lines and slid it into his jacket pocket. He turned back to the window of her room. Through the glass he could see the nurses finishing their work, the monitor steady, the small silver-haired woman lying still under a white blanket in the private light. He did not go home that night. The file arrived at 2:17 in the morning. Chun's intelligence chief set it on the desk without ceremony and stood back the way he always stood back when delivering information he had not fully processed himself, with the particular stillness of a man who has learned that his job is to bring the facts and leave the conclusions to someone else. He had worked for Chun for 9 years. In that time he had delivered files covering things that would have shaken most people to their foundations. He had learned to read the quality of his boss's silences the way a sailor reads weather. This silence, when Chun opened the file, was one he had not encountered before. Her name was Choi Soon-Yi. 68 years old. Born in Jingzhi. Raised and educated in Busan, where she had worked as a primary school teacher for 11 years before leaving her position in 1993. Widow. No surviving children. Current residence, a modest apartment in Reimagined, Seoul, where neighbors described her as quiet, solitary, always gone before the rest of the building was awake, always returning late in the evening with the particular tiredness of someone who had spent the day on foot. Chun read the file slowly. He was not a man who read slowly. He had built everything he had by being faster than the room he was in, by processing information at a pace that left other people reaching for conclusions he had already drawn, filed, and acted on. But he read this file at the pace of someone who was not entirely sure they wanted to reach the end of it. Choi Soon-Yi had left her teaching position 2 years after her son disappeared. The file noted this the way files note things, as a data point, without weight. But Chun sat with the weight of it for a moment before moving on. A woman who loved her work enough to do it for 11 years, who had presumably planned to keep doing it, who had built a life inside those 11 years, and who had one day simply stopped. Not because she wanted to. Because something had happened that rearranged everything else into background noise. She had printed her first missing child flyer in the spring of 1991. She had distributed them in Busan first, then spread outward from there the way grief spreads when it cannot find its object, covering more and more ground, refusing to accept that the ground it had already covered was the answer. She had traveled to Daegu, to Seoul, to Incheon, to Jeonju, to Jeju. She had appeared on 2 television programs and 1 radio call-in show. She had followed 250 separate leads across 14 years before the trail went cold enough that the private investigators her husband had hired stopped returning calls. She had not stopped. She had joined a missing children's network and thrown herself into its work the way people throw themselves into something when they need the motion of purpose to get through the day. In searching for her own son, she had helped locate and reunite 9 other children with their families. The people around her called this remarkable. She had said in one recorded interview that it was the only way she knew how to keep moving forward without her legs giving out from under her. Chun paused on that line for a moment. Her husband, Choi Dae-ho, had died in 2007. The official cause listed on the death certificate was cardiac arrest. Chun had been in this world long enough to know that official causes and true causes were not always the same document. Some men die of their hearts failing in the clinical sense. And some men die of their hearts failing in the only sense that actually matters, slowly, quietly, across years, under the weight of a grief that medicine has no category for and time does not touch. She had buried him on a hillside in Busan on a gray morning in November. Before they closed the casket, She had taken the photograph from her coat pocket and placed it inside his jacket, against his chest. The photograph of a 3-year-old boy with round cheeks and a small scar and eyes that tilted upward at the corners. So that wherever Dae-ho was going, he would have his son's face with him. So that he would not have to go to wherever that was without it. Then she had come home. And she had kept searching. Chun closed the file. He set it down on the desk with the same flatness he brought to every piece of paper that passed through his hands. He looked at the wall in front of him and said nothing for long enough that the silence in the room began to have texture. Then he looked at his intelligence chief. Blood type. From the hospital intake form. The man had anticipated this. He had pulled it before coming up. Be negative, sir. He paused with the precision of someone who had rehearsed the next part and was still not sure how to deliver it. Extremely rare. Less than 2% of the population. He met Chun's eyes for a moment. Your own medical file lists the same blood type. Chun did not react. This was not unusual. Chun almost never reacted. But there was something in the quality of the stillness that followed that was not the usual stillness, and his intelligence chief was experienced enough to feel the difference without being able to name it. Chun turned his eyes back to the wall. After a long stretch of silence he spoke again, and his voice was level and precise and gave nothing away. Order a DNA comparison. Use the blood sample from her hospital intake. Do not inform her. Do not discuss this with anyone else in this building. When the results are ready, you bring them to me and you bring them to no one else. Is that clear? Perfectly, sir. Then go. The door closed. Chun sat alone in his office in the middle of the night, the file in front of him and the 1991 flyer folded in his jacket pocket and the blood type number sitting in the air of the room like something that had not finished speaking yet. He did not reach for his phone. He did not call anyone. He sat with all of it in the way that people sit with things that are too large to set down and too dangerous to hold any tighter than absolutely necessary. He did not sleep that night either. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you are here the moment the next episode drops. Things are about to shift in a direction no one in this story is prepared for. This is the part of the story where we need to stop moving forward for a moment and go back instead. Not because the past is more important than the present, but because you cannot fully understand who Chun Min-Jun is without understanding who he was first, and you cannot understand who he was without understanding what was done to him before he was old enough to resist it or even to know that resistance was something that existed. The man he became did not come from nowhere. He came from a specific theft, committed on a specific Tuesday, and from everything that was built on top of that theft in the years that followed. The boy taken from the Jigalki market in Busan in the spring of 1991 was 3 years old. 3 years old means you do not yet have language for the things that happen to you. You do not have the words for abduction or for grief or for the particular quality of wrongness that settles into a child's body when the person they trust most in the world is suddenly not there. You only have the feeling itself, raw and enormous and with no container. You only know that something warm and safe and entirely familiar was in your hand one moment, and then it was not, and the world since then has been very loud and very cold in a way that it was not before. He passed through 2 intermediaries before he arrived in the household of Director Hwang Tae-sik. Director Hwang was a man of significant standing within the Chongryong Syndicate, a senior architect of its operations, a person who had accumulated wealth and influence in quantities that most men only approach in their most unguarded fantasies. He had everything that power could arrange. Everything, that is, except a successor. Not a biological heir which could have been arranged through other means, but a specific kind of successor, one built entirely from the ground up, shaped by his hands alone, loyal not by accident of blood but by the more durable mechanism of constructed identity. A person who believed, at the foundational level of his own understanding, that everything he was had come from one source, and that the debt of that was unpayable and therefore permanent. The boy was given a new name, a new origin story. He was told in the matter-of-fact way that Director Hwang delivered all information, that his birth parents had died in a house fire when he was barely old enough to walk. That Hwang himself had pulled him from the wreckage. That the life he had now, every comfort and every opportunity and every future that stretched out in front of him, existed because of that rescue. The debt of a saved life, Hwang told him more than once, is not a debt that can be settled. It is a debt that is honored continuously by the life you go on to live. The boy grew up honoring it. He was educated, but he was trained first. He learned to read a room before he learned to read a book. He learned leverage and patience and the precise art of saying less than you knew in situations where most people said more. He learned that emotion displayed openly was a resource that other people could use against you, and that the discipline of withholding it was not coldness but strategy. He learned that every relationship was a negotiation, that every alliance had a price embedded in it somewhere, and that the only way to survive in a world built on those principles was to be better at them than everyone else in the room. He was. Consistently. From very young. By 22 he had become genuinely indispensable to the syndicate's operations in ways that went beyond what Hwang had originally designed. By 27 he had, with a precision that people who witnessed it still talked about in careful language, removed every significant figure that stood between him and command. Not through recklessness. Through patience and calculation and an ability to wait longer than his opponents expected anyone to wait. By 30 there was simply no question left about who led the Chongryong organization. There was only Chun. He chose the name himself. The character for Sky. A man who functions above the reach of ordinary consequence. And he was. By every external measure, he was complete. He had built something from nothing that most men with every advantage could not have built from everything. He had earned his position in the only currency that the world he inhabited recognized. But there was one thing none of his men could explain, and most of them had eventually stopped trying. Every few months, Chun drove alone. No driver. No bodyguards. No stated destination. He would take one of the unremarkable cars, the ones that did not announce themselves, and disappear into the city in the late evening and be gone for 2 or 3 hours before returning. He never explained these drives. He never mentioned them afterward. But the men who had been with him longest had noticed the pattern, and some of them had noticed something else too, that he always returned from these drives with the windows cracked, even in cold weather, as if he had been trying to catch something from the outside air. The smell of a large fish market in the early morning. The sound quality of a crowded outdoor stall, vendors and movement, and the particular noise of a city doing commerce at close range. The feeling, sourceless and specific, of a small warm hand folded inside his. Things he could not explain and did not try to. Things he had never spoken out loud because he did not have language for them, only the feeling itself, a reaching, a recognition of absence, like trying to remember the words to a song you have never consciously learned. He had buried those feelings so thoroughly and for so long that he could no longer identify what they were. He did not know they were memory. He did not know they were grief. He did not know that every time he drove through Seoul with the window down and something in him reaching for a smell or a sound or the warmth of a hand that was not there, he was doing the same thing that a 68-year-old woman with silver hair was doing on the other side of the city with her coat pocket full of flyers. He was searching. He just did not know yet what he was searching for. She woke up at 4 in the morning. Consciousness returned to her the way it always does after a long absence, in pieces, assembling itself slowly and out of order. Ceiling first. White and unfamiliar. Then the sound, the soft rhythmic beeping of a monitor to her left, steady and unalarmed, doing its work. Then the smell, antiseptic underneath something else, something cleaner and more expensive than any hospital she had been in before, the kind of institution whose resources showed up in small sensory details like the quality of the air and the weight of the blanket and the way the light was calibrated to be present without being harsh. She turned her head slowly and took in the room. Private. Single occupancy. Flowers on the windowsill that had not been there when she lost consciousness, which meant someone had placed them while she slept, which meant someone had been thinking about what the room should feel like for the person waking up in it. That was an unusual kind of consideration. It landed somewhere in the middle of her chest without her knowing quite what to do with it. She lay still for another moment and let the pieces finish assembling. The crosswalk. The headlights coming at her through the dark, too fast and too bright and too close. The way her legs had simply stopped cooperating, as if they had finally made the decision she had been refusing to make for them for 3 decades. She had been carrying those legs across every district of Seoul for 32 years, and they had held her, through every lead and every dead end, and every morning she woke up and chose to start again. And last night, in the middle of a crosswalk in the Han River district, they had stopped. She had 15 new flyers in her bag. She had been on her way to the community board near the bus shelter on the Mapo Road, because she had not posted there since March, and 4 months was too long to leave a gap in any location. She was meticulous about gaps. Gaps were how people missed things. She had not stopped searching for a single day in 32 years. Not one. She became aware, at some point during this careful inventory of herself, that she was not alone in the room. She did not see him immediately. She felt the quality of the room change first, the way a room changes when someone is in it who carries a certain kind of weight, not physical but atmospheric, the kind of presence that adjusts the air pressure around it without trying to. Then she turned her head toward the doorway and saw the outline of him. Tall. Very still. Dark suit. Backlit by the corridor light so that his face was in partial shadow, only the shape of him clear, and the stillness, and something about the angle of his eyes when the light caught them for a moment. The angle of his eyes. She told herself firmly that she had been doing this for 32 years and she knew better. She had learned, at significant cost, what it did to a person to let hope off its leash before the evidence justified it. She had learned that lesson 250 times. She was not going to learn it a 251st. Her hands found the photograph on the bedside table. Someone had taken it from her coat pocket and placed it there for her, which meant someone had understood without being told that it was the first thing she would reach for. She picked it up and held it in both hands the way she always did, the 3-year-old face steady and familiar under her fingers, the round cheeks and the small scar and the eyes tilted upward at their corners with that expression she had never stopped looking for in the face of every adult stranger she had passed on. Every street in every city she had walked through in 3 decades. She did not speak to the man in the doorway. She did not know how. She had nothing to offer him, no context, no explanation for why an elderly woman had collapsed in his crosswalk with a bag full of missing child flyers. She did not even know for certain who he was or what kind of man had arranged this room, these flowers, this careful warmth. She spoke past him instead. Past the doorway and past the corridor and past the city outside the window and past all the years of roads that had led to this room and this moment. She spoke to the air the way you speak to something when it is too large to be addressed directly. Min-Jun. She said it at barely more than a breath. His name. The name she had given him. The name she had spoken into every empty crosswalk and every late-night kitchen and every hillside in Busan where she had gone to tell her husband that she was still looking, she was still going, she had not stopped. The name that no living person had called this man in over 30 years. The man in the doorway went absolutely still. Not the stillness of someone who has heard something that does not concern them. Not the stillness of confusion or impatience or the professional blankness he wore everywhere else. A different kind of stillness entirely. The kind that happens when something reaches past every layer of protection a person has built for themselves and touches something underneath that the protection was never designed to cover. He did not correct her. He did not tell her she had the wrong man or that she was confused or that she should rest and he would send someone to help her. He did not leave. And somewhere behind everything Chun Min-Jun had constructed of himself over 36 years, in the oldest and most sealed-off place, something made a sound like the very first crack in a wall that has been holding against something for far, far too long. Chun's intelligence team found it on a Thursday evening, buried 4 directories deep in a private server that had belonged to one of Director Hwang Tae-sik's most trusted former lieutenants, a man who had retired from the organization 3 years ago under circumstances that were officially described as voluntary and unofficially understood to be somewhat more complicated than that. The lieutenant's name was not important. What was important was that he was the kind of man who understood the value of keeping things. Not out of sentimentality, but out of the same instinct that makes certain animals store more food than they can eat in a single season. Information, in the world they all inhabited, was the insurance that paid out when everything else had been taken. You kept things. Quietly. Indefinitely. Because you never knew when the thing you kept would become the thing you needed. The file was a digital audio recording, 47 minutes long, dated 3 years earlier. Chun's intelligence chief delivered it without comment. He had listened to the first 4 minutes before deciding that this was not his decision to make, and that the correct thing to do was bring it directly to Chun and remove himself from the room. Which was what he did. Chun sat alone at his desk at 9 in the evening, the city going about its business 20 floors below, and he pressed play. The voice that came out of the recording was Director Huang's. Older than Chun remembered it. The illness had been in it by the time this was recorded, roughening the edges and slowing the cadence in the way that illness does when it has been working on a person for long enough to show. Huang had believed, at the time he made this recording, that he was dying. His doctors had given him a number of months that had turned out to be pessimistic, since he had in fact survived, but at the moment he sat down in front of that microphone he had believed otherwise. And a man who believes he is dying sometimes feels the need to say things he has spent years not saying, not out of guilt precisely, but out of something more complicated than guilt. A desire to have the record exist somewhere, even if only in the possession of one person, even if that person is instructed to keep it private. A desire not to take a thing entirely with you into whatever comes next. What Director Huang said on the recording, in a calm and unhurried tone that Chun found more disturbing than any anger or regret would have been, was this. The boy was not rescued from a fire. The fire did not happen. The boy was purchased, in Busan, from intermediaries who had taken him from a market in the spring of 1991. His mother was alive. She did not die. She has been, to my knowledge, actively looking for him since the year he was taken. I was aware of this. I received information about her search on more than one occasion over the years. I considered it a minor administrative detail and took no action in response to it. A minor administrative detail. Chun reached out and stopped the recording. He did not move for a long time. A minor administrative detail. That was the phrase Director Huang had used to describe a woman who had walked the length of Korea for 32 years with a photograph in her coat pocket. A woman who had buried her husband with that photograph against his chest, because she could not bear the thought of him going wherever the dead go without his son's face to carry with him. A woman who was lying right now in a private hospital room 3 kilometers from this office, with flowers on the windowsill that Chun himself had told someone to put there, and a bag full of 3 decades of folded flyers on the chair beside her bed. A minor administrative detail. He sat with those 4 words in the silence of his office for a long time. He let them be what they were. He did not try to reframe them or contextualize them or find the angle from which they became something more defensible than what they plainly were. He had spent his entire career in a world that ran on the construction and maintenance of useful fictions, and he knew better than most people what it cost to let a fiction stand unchallenged when the truth was sitting right there in the room. The truth was sitting right there in the room. He did not listen to the rest of the recording. 47 minutes was the length of it, and he had stopped at the part that mattered, the part that rewrote everything that came before it, and whatever the remaining 40 minutes contained was not going to change what those first 7 had already done. He reached for the page his intelligence chief had also left on the desk before leaving. The one in the sealed envelope. The one that had come back from a hospital's laboratory earlier that afternoon and that Chun had told himself twice he was not ready to open, each time setting it back down and walking away from it, and each time finding himself returning to it within the hour. He had not been ready this morning. He was not entirely sure he was ready now. But there is a kind of courage that lives at a different address from the kind that gets documented and feared and built into a reputation over 20 years of running one of the most powerful criminal organizations in Korea. That other kind of courage is quieter. It does not announce itself. It does not win anything or take anything or prove anything to anyone watching. It is simply the willingness to know the truth, even when knowing it means that the version of yourself you have been living inside for your entire adult life is about to be replaced by something you cannot yet see the shape of. Chun picked up the envelope. He opened it. 1 page. Laboratory letterhead at the top, precise and impersonal. A reference number. A date. A single paragraph of technical language establishing the methodology used and the confidence interval of the result. And then, at the bottom of that paragraph, one line of conclusion stated in the flat declarative certainty that laboratory results use because they have no reason to soften anything. 99.97% biological match. Mother and son. He read it once. Then he folded it back along the same crease it had come in and held it in his hand and looked at the wall for a moment. Then he stood up and walked to the window and stood there looking out at Seoul. The city was doing what it always did. Running. Performing. Staying lit and loud and relentlessly itself through every hour of the night, because that was what this city was and what it had always been, a place that did not have an off switch and did not believe in one. 20 floors below him the lights moved and the traffic breathed and the Han River caught the glow of the bridge and threw it back at the sky, and all of it continued exactly as it had been continuing before he opened that envelope, because the city had not been waiting for this moment and did not know it had happened. He stood at the window for a long time. His lead bodyguard, positioned in the doorway as instructed, watching without appearing to watch in the particular way that 11 years of this work had trained him to do, would describe it later in private to two of the others using words he admitted were inadequate. He would say that the boss stood at that window longer than he had ever stood still before. Longer than the Incheon negotiation in 2019, when three of the most powerful men in the southern operation had tried to restructure the agreement in a way that would have cost the Chongryong organization a third of its southern revenue, and Chun had stood at a window then too, for about 20 minutes, before turning around and dismantling their position in 4 sentences. Longer than after the Busan territorial loss in 2021, which had cost them more than money. Longer than anything this man had witnessed in 11 years of standing in doorways. He just stood there, the bodyguard would say, and the way he was standing was different. He looked like a person who had just been told something that changed the category of everything that came before it. He looked like someone doing the math on a life that had just been given an entirely new set of numbers. That was as close as the bodyguard could get to it in language. Here is what he could not have articulated but was nevertheless true. Chun Min-Jun was standing at that window making an accounting. Not of assets or territories or the organizational chart of the empire he had built, but of something much older than any of that. He was standing at that window understanding, in the wordless way that true understanding arrives before language can catch up to it, a series of things that he had not known an hour ago. He had not been orphaned. He had been taken. He had not been rescued from the wreckage of a fire. There had been no fire, no wreckage, no dying parents, no moment of chaos from which a generous man had pulled an infant and decided to give him a life. There had been a market in Busan and a Tuesday in April and 30 seconds in which a small hand had been released and not retaken, and everything that had happened to him after that had been built on the back of those 30 seconds without his knowledge or consent. Everything he believed about who he was, where he came from, what he owed and to whom he owed it, had been constructed by a man who had looked at a stolen child and seen an administrative opportunity. And the woman on the other side of that construction, the woman who was not dead and had never been dead, was lying in a hospital 3 kilometers away with 32 years of his face in her bag and a name for him that no one else had used in all that time. He stood at the window until the accounting was finished. Then he set the folded paper on the desk. He took off his jacket and hung it on the back of his chair with the same unhurried precision he brought to every physical action, the precision of a man who had learned that how you handle small things broadcasts what you are made of to everyone watching. He straightened his shirt. He pressed 2 fingers to the scar above his left eyebrow for the last time as a person who still had a question about it. He walked out of the office and down the corridor alone. His bodyguards moved immediately to fall in behind him. He stopped them with one raised hand, not turning around, not looking back. This one he would do alone. Subscribe before you scroll any further. The next chapter is the one this whole story has been building toward since the moment those brakes screamed. Choi Soon-Yi was sitting up in the hospital bed when the door opened for the 3rd time that morning. She had arranged herself with the particular careful dignity of a person who has learned over many years to meet the world in a posture of readiness rather than waiting, because waiting with your guard down is how hope ambushes you before you have decided whether to let it in. Her hands were folded in her lap. The photograph was on the blanket in front of her, face up, the 3-year-old boy looking at the ceiling with his permanent expression of quiet amusement. She had been awake since before dawn, as she almost always was. Old habit. Old necessity. The mornings had always been hers because the evenings belonged to whatever the day had produced, and the mornings were when she could fold the next set of flyers and think clearly and decide which part of the city she had not covered recently enough. She had been told, gently and without much detail, that the man who had arranged her care was a person of significant importance. She had not pushed for more than that. 32 years of talking to strangers about something they could not help her with had taught her the specific discipline of receiving what people were willing to give and not reaching for what they were not. You learned that, or you burned through goodwill so fast that eventually no one would open their door to you at all. So she had spent the quiet hours of that morning doing what she always did in quiet hours. She thought about Dae-ho. She thought about the 9 children who had gone home because she had kept moving on the days when stopping would have been so much easier. She thought about the community board in Mapo that she had not gotten to last night and would need to get to today, assuming the doctors cleared her, assuming the important man in the dark suit had no objection to her continuing to exist on her own terms in the city. She thought about all the streets she had walked and all the faces she had looked at and all the mornings she had risen before the sun and decided, again, to keep going. She was 68 years old. She was tired in a way that sleep did not reach. But she had been tired like that since 1991, and she had learned to carry it the way you carry something that has become part of your body, not as a burden exactly, but as weight you have simply incorporated into how you move. The door opened. He came in without his jacket. She noticed that first, and it struck her as significant in a way she could not immediately explain. The jacket was the thing that made a man like this a particular kind of man, the armor of it, the signal. Without it he looked younger than she had expected. Not young, but younger, the way a person looks when something has been removed that they did not know they were using to hold a certain version of themselves in place. His face was sharp and composed and had clearly spent decades being exactly as readable as its owner chose to make it at any given moment, which was usually not very. But she was 68 years old and she had spent 32 years studying faces in the way that only people who are looking for something very specific in faces learn to study them, and she could see beneath the composure something that had come undone. Not dramatically. Not in any way that would have registered to someone not specifically looking for it. But it was there. He crossed the room slowly. He stopped at the edge of her bed. He looked at her. Not through her, not past her. Not with the careful neutral regard of someone performing a social obligation. He looked at her the way people look at something they have been both afraid of and unable to stop moving toward, with a kind of terrible attention that had been building pressure for a long time before it was finally allowed to arrive at its object. His eyes moved from her face to the photograph on the blanket, then back to her face. His hand came up, unhurried, and 2 fingers pressed against the scar above his left eyebrow. The one above the left eyebrow. In exactly the location it was in the photograph. The same scar on the same eyebrow of the same face that had grown from round-cheeked and 3 years old into the sharp-featured and devastatingly still face of the man standing at the edge of her hospital bed. Choi Soon-Yi stopped breathing. Not from shock exactly. Not from disbelief. But from something older than either of those things, a recognition that was happening below the level of conscious thought, in the part of a mother that does not operate on evidence or logic, but on something that 32 years of searching had never been able to exhaust. She knew. He lowered himself into the chair beside her bed. He did not rush it. He sat forward, elbows on his knees, close to her, as close as the furniture allowed. His hands rested between his knees and they were not quite steady, and she could see that, and she looked at them the way she had looked at every pair of hands that might once, in another life, have been small enough to disappear inside hers. In a room that had gone absolutely silent, in a hospital in Seoul, in the city that had swallowed him for 32 years, he said one word. Yama. Mother. The sound that came from Choi Soon-Yi was not a word. It would not have been possible to call it a word. Words have edges and definitions and a discrete relationship to the thing they refer to. What came out of her had none of that. It was not contained enough to be language. It was the sound of something structural giving way, the particular release of a weight that has been held in one position for so long that the act of setting it down is almost indistinguishable from collapse. It was 32 years in a single breath. It was every 4 o'clock morning when she had risen in the dark and sat at the kitchen table and folded flyers by lamplight, not because she believed each individual flyer would be the one that worked, but because the folding was the thing she had to hold on to, the ritual that organized the grief into something she could walk forward inside of. It was every phone call that had ended in silence on the other end, the silence of a lead dissolving, of another door closing. It was every face in every crowd in every market in every city she had passed through that had been close, so close, eyes tilted in the right direction or a jaw shaped a certain way, and then resolved into the face of someone else's son. It was Dae-ho. It was the hospital room in 2007 where the machines had stopped and she had sat beside him and held his hand and told him out loud that she was not finished, that she was going to keep going, that she would find their son, that she promised, that he could go now but she was not going to stop, she was never going to stop. It was the hillside in Busan on a gray morning, and the photograph she had pressed against his chest before they closed the casket, and the prayer she had said into the November air that he would know, wherever he was, that she had kept her word. It was 9 other families who had their children back. It was 9 reunion moments she had witnessed and celebrated with her whole heart while her own son was still somewhere in the world being someone else, living under someone else's name, carrying a scar that someone else had explained to him with a lie. All of it came out in that single breath, and then her hands were moving. She pressed them to his face. She held his face in both hands, this adult face with its sharp angles and its composed lines and the 36 years of living that had accumulated in it since the round cheeks and the open delight of the boy in the photograph, and she felt the shape of him under her palms and she felt the familiar geometry of it, the specific tilt of the eyes, the particular architecture of the jaw, the scar above the left eyebrow worn smooth by decades of time, and every cell in her body that had been calibrated to a 3-year-old boy recalibrated without being asked to, and said yes. He let her. This was the part that would stay with the 3 men standing in the corridor outside for the rest of their lives. Not what they heard through the door, though that was considerable. But this, that Chun Min-Jun, who in 11 years of working in close proximity to him had never once been touched by another person in their presence without a reaction that made very clear it would not be tolerated again, sat in a hospital chair with his mother's hands on his face and closed his eyes. He did not move away. He did not stiffen. He did not reassert the boundary that he maintained around himself everywhere else in his life like a border with armed guards at every crossing. He closed his eyes and he stayed very still and he let her hold him. "I told you," she whispered. She said it into the top of his head when he bowed it toward her hands. Her voice was shaking the way voices shake when the thing they are saying has been waiting long enough that the saying of it is almost too large for the throat to manage. "I told you I would find you. I told you, Min-Jun. I told you. I told you." He took her hands in both of his. He bowed his head over them. He held them there. And if he said anything else in that room, if there were words that passed between them in the minutes that followed, those words belonged only to them, and to the 32 years of distance that they were beginning together, the slow and complicated and probably never fully completable work of closing. Outside in the corridor, 3 men stood in a row. They had been trained for confrontation. They had stood guard through negotiations that rewrote organizational charts and standoffs that could have gone differently at any second in situations where their professional composure had been the difference between a controllable outcome and something much worse. Their hands knew how to be ready. Their faces knew how to be neutral. Their bodies knew how to occupy a corridor in a way that communicated exactly the right amount of unmovable presence. Tonight their hands were at their sides. One of them, the one with the most years of service, the one who had heard the word the boss had said when he walked into that room, pressed the back of his hand to his face and held it there for a moment, and then put his hand back at his side and stared straight ahead at the wall opposite. The other 2 did not look at him. Nobody mentioned it. There are things you carry with you from the work you do that you do not discuss. There are rooms you guard that you do not describe afterward. There are moments you are present for that belong to the people inside them and not to you, And the only decent thing you can do with those moments is hold the line and let them be sacred and take them quietly home with you at the end of the shift and fold them away somewhere and never take them back out again. Some doors, they all understood now in the particular wordless way that understanding arrives when it is large enough to have weight, you simply guard. You do not question what is kept behind them. You do not need to. If this story moved something in you, share it with someone who needs it today. And subscribe so you are here for every story we bring you like this one. We are just getting started. I want to take a moment before we close, because every story worth telling deserves one. We spend a lot of time in this world talking about power. What it looks like, how it works, how you get it and keep it, and how other people respond to it. We build stories around power because power is visible. It has shape and presence and consequence, and it announces itself when it enters a room. Chun Min-Jun was powerful in every way that the world recognizes and rewards. He had built an empire from nothing. He had made himself untouchable. He had sealed off every part of himself that could be reached or hurt or changed by something he had not chosen. And a 68-year-old woman with an old bag full of folded flyers walked through all of it. Not because she was stronger. Not because she had advantages he did not. But because she had one thing that does not appear on any organizational chart or balance sheet or criminal intelligence file. She had refused, one day at a time for 32 years, to call it over. And that refusal, practiced daily and without audience and without reward and in the full knowledge that it might never produce the thing she was doing it for, turned out to be more durable than everything he had built on top of himself to keep the world out. That is the lesson I want you to sit with. Not that love conquers all, because that phrase has been said so many times it has stopped meaning anything. But that love which decides to be serious, love which gets up before dawn and folds the next set of flyers and walks the next set of streets and files the next lead and buries its husband and keeps going anyway, that kind of love is not soft. It is not passive. It does not wait for conditions to improve or for someone to make it easier. It is one of the most demanding and disciplined and quietly devastating forces that a human life can contain. There is also something in this story that needs to be named plainly and not wrapped in the warmth of the reunion. A child was stolen. A mother's life was reorganized around an absence that someone else created for profit and convenience. A man grew up not knowing who he was because another man decided that truth was a minor administrative detail. And the cost of those 30 seconds in a Busan market, those 30 seconds of a small hand released and not retaken, was paid across 32 years by everyone who loved that child. By the mother who kept walking. By the father who died with a grief too large for any heart. By the man himself, who built an entire identity on a foundation that was never real, who drove through Seoul in the dark every few months reaching for a smell or a sound or the warmth of a hand and did not know he was grieving something he had never been allowed to remember losing. That is what the theft of a child costs. Not just the child. Everyone. I am not telling you this to leave you in a dark place. I am telling you this because stories that show us the full weight of a thing are the only ones that actually help us understand it. And understanding it is the beginning of caring about it in the way that care has to be applied, not just to fictional reunions but to the real families who are still searching, the real mothers who are still walking, the real children who are still somewhere in the world waiting to be found. She found him. After everything. She found him. That is what love looks like when it decides not to stop. Take care of each other. Pay attention to the people around you who are carrying something heavy in silence. And do not underestimate what is possible when someone simply refuses, one day at a time, to give up.